When you think of the American Mafia, you probably think of the five families of New York or the Chicago outfit. Their names are legendary, their stories practically etched into the national identity. But up in the northeast corner of the country, another crime dynasty ruled for more than half a century. Their control was just as total, and their methods were just as brutal. They didn't run their empire from the flashy casinos of Las Vegas or the skyscrapers of Manhattan. Their kingdom was the cobblestone streets of Boston, the tight-knit neighborhoods of Providence, and the quiet towns of Connecticut. This was the domain of the Patriarca crime family. For decades, they were the invisible government of New England. From the highest levels of politics right down to the jukebox in a local bar, nothing moved without their say-so, and nobody made a dime without giving them a piece. They built an empire on gambling, fear, and blood, all overseen by one of the most feared bosses in the history of the American Cosa Nostra. This is the story of their dark takeover, a tale of ruthless ambition, unchecked power, and the betrayals that would finally bring their whole world crashing down. Hook. Back in 1965, if you wanted to run a simple dice game in Providence, you had two choices: pay Raymond Patriarca, or get a visit. A bookmaker named Willie Mafia thought he could defy the boss and refused to pay his tribute. That visit was fatal. His murder in a phone booth wasn't just another gangland hit, it was a message broadcast across all 6 states of New England. In this territory, every dollar, every street corner, and every life was under the control of one man and his family. For decades, the Patriarca crime family ruled with an iron fist, but even empires built on fear can be brought down from within. Section 1: The Power Vacuum. To understand how one man could grab control of an entire region, you have to look at the chaos that came before him. In the early 20th century, as Italian immigrants settled in New England's industrial cities, they formed close communities in neighborhoods like Boston's North End and Providence's Federal Hill. Inside these enclaves, early forms of organized crime started to take root. Then Prohibition hit, and things exploded. In Boston, a mobster named Gaspar Messina rose to the top, while in Providence, a man named Frank Morelli built a powerful operation on bootlegging and illegal gambling. These were separate crews, often fighting with ruthless Irish gangs like South Boston's Guston Gang. The streets were a bloody mess of shifting territories and violent power grabs. In 1931, the Guston Gang's leader, Frank Wallace, was famously gunned down in a North End speakeasy, a hit arranged by the Italian mob to consolidate its power. It was out of this violent world that a new, more ambitious generation of criminals would emerge. A Sicilian mobster named Philip Bucola eventually merged the Boston and Providence factions, creating a unified New England crime family for the first time. He ruled from East Boston, battling rival gangs and cementing Italian control. But by the early 1950s, with the feds breathing down his neck for tax evasion, Bucola knew his time was up. He needed a successor, someone smart, ruthless, and with the vision to not just hold the empire together, but to grow it bigger than anyone imagined. He didn't have to look far. His choice was a man who had been patiently and brutally working his way up the ranks for 2 decades. His name was Raymond L.S. Patriarca. Bucola's retirement and departure for Sicily in 1954 created the ultimate power vacuum, leaving the throne of New England's underworld empty. And Raymond Patriarca, a man already known to law enforcement as public enemy number 1 in Providence, was more than ready to take it. Section 2: The Rise of a Don. Raymond Salvatore Lorita Patriarca wasn't born into crime royalty. He was born in Worcester, Massachusetts, in 1908 to Italian immigrants, and his family moved to Providence, Rhode Island, when he was just 4. He grew up on the tough streets of Federal Hill, dropping out of school at 8 to shine shoes and work as a bellhop. A legit life was never really in the cards. By the time he was a teenager, his rap sheet was already decorated with charges for hijacking, armed robbery, and auto theft. He was hungry, ambitious, and had what investigators would later call a rare combination of street smarts and brutal determination. During Prohibition, Patriarca did his apprenticeship in bootlegging, hijacking, and even prostitution. He became the can-do guy, the man New York families like the Prophecies and Lucianos called when they needed something handled in New England. But he wasn't just a thug, he was a strategic thinker who understood that real power came from influence, not just force. As early as 1938, after a larceny conviction landed him a 5-year prison sentence, he was mysteriously paroled after serving only a few months, a move that kicked off a political scandal and proved he already had powerful connections. Throughout the 1940s, while others were fighting for scraps, Patriarca was building his foundation. He rose to the rank of captain, proving his loyalty and his capacity for violence again and again. When Philip Bucola decided to retire, he personally chose Patriarca to take his place, even throwing him a huge party at his Rhode Island mansion. It was basically a coronation. Patriarca officially took over day-to-day operations in 1952. One of his first and smartest moves was relocating the family's entire center of power. Boston had been the traditional seat, but Patriarca saw the strategic advantage of his home turf. He moved the headquarters to Providence, right into the Federal Hill neighborhood where he was already a living legend. He set up shop in a modest building at 168 Atwells Avenue, the home of a seemingly legitimate business called the National Cigarette Service Company and Coinomatic Distributors. This unassuming storefront, known to insiders simply as the office, would become the nerve center of a criminal empire that stretched across New England. From this building, Patriarca would rule for the next 3 decades with absolute authority. He put his most trusted underboss, Gennaro Jerry Angiulo, in charge of the family's lucrative Boston rackets. He installed Henry, the referee, Tame Leo as his consigliere, a wise advisor to handle disputes. With his leadership team locked in, Raymond Patriarca began to systematically and ruthlessly transform the disorganized crews of New England into a single, cohesive, and terrifyingly efficient machine, the Patriarca crime family. His dark takeover had begun. Section 3, The Iron Fist. Under Raymond Patriarca, New England didn't just have an organized crime family, it was a subjugated kingdom. His reign was defined by an iron-fisted control that touched every level of society. From the office on Federal Hill, Patriarca's reach was absolute. Federal Hill itself became like a fortress. Spotters were constantly on the lookout for cops or unfamiliar faces, and Patriarca himself would often stand outside, puffing a cigar, surveying his domain. He was so feared he rarely needed a bodyguard, walking the streets of his neighborhood like he was untouchable. The family's rackets were vast. The core of the business was the usual mob stuff: illegal gambling, loan sharking, and extortion. Every card game, every bookie, every prostitution ring in Providence, Boston, or Hartford had to pay a kickback to the family. Not paying wasn't an option. Loan sharking, or shylocking, was another huge money maker. They'd lend cash at insane interest rates to desperate businessmen or gambling addicts. If you were late with a payment, the consequences were brutally physical. But what really set the Patriarca family's takeover apart was their infiltration of legitimate businesses. Chief among them was the vending machine industry. Patriarca's front, the National Cigarette Service Company, was more than a money laundering scheme, it was a tool for total market domination. If a bar owner wanted a jukebox or a cigarette machine, they got one from Patriarca's company. If they already had one from a competitor, one of Patriarca's guys would pay them a visit, and the competing machine would mysteriously disappear, replaced by one from Coinomatic. Nobody was brave enough to refuse. Through this seemingly boring business, the family had eyes and ears in thousands of places across the region, collecting cash daily and making their presence known on every street corner. The family's influence went far beyond vending machines. Patriarca held hidden interests in Las Vegas casinos like the Dunes Hotel, skimming profits right out of the count rooms. He even had a seat on the National Mafia Commission, the ruling body of La Cosa Nostra in America, putting him on equal footing with the bosses of New York's 5 families. He brokered deals and settled disputes, establishing the Connecticut River as the formal dividing line between his territory and that of the New York families. But this whole empire was built on terror. Patriarcha was a ruthless leader who didn't tolerate any challenges to his authority. During the bloody Irish mob wars in Boston in the 1960s, he allegedly ordered hits on members of the McLaughlin gang to keep the conflict going and weaken his Irish rivals. The stories about his ruthlessness were chilling. In one infamous incident, it's alleged he ordered an elderly mobster to murder his own son over a bad debt. His underboss talked him out of it, but the message was clear: loyalty to the family, and to him, came before everything, even blood. The 1966 murder of Willie Mafia was the ultimate proof of this rule. Mafia, a big-shot Providence bookmaker, refused to pay Patriarcha his tribute and had the nerve to assault Patriarcha's consigliere. For that, Mafia was gunned down in a phone booth. 2 years later, when Mafia's brother Rudy sought revenge, he and an associate were killed in a grocery store, another hit allegedly ordered by the boss. These weren't just murders. They were public executions designed to enforce one single, unbreakable rule. In New England, Raymond Patriarcha was king, and his word was law. Section 4. Cracks in the Empire. For decades, the Patriarcha Empire seemed unbreakable. Raymond Patriarcha had unified the region, built a massive criminal enterprise, and crushed anyone who stood in his way. But by the late 1970s and early 80s, two forces were closing in, ready to shatter his kingdom. One was a rival gang operating right under his nose, and the other was the federal government, which was about to unleash a weapon that would change the game forever. The first crack was the Winter Hill Gang. Based in Somerville, Massachusetts, this mostly Irish-American crew had been a subordinate group for years. They ran rackets in the Boston area and were expected to pay tribute to Patriarcha's Boston underboss, Jerry Angulo. But under the leadership of the infamous James Whitey Bulger, the Winter Hill Gang got more ambitious. And they had a secret weapon. In 1975, Bulger and his top associate, Stephen the Rifleman Flemmi, became top-echelon informants for the FBI, handled by a corrupt agent named John Connolly. The deal was simple: Bulger and Flemmi would feed the FBI information on their rivals, the Patriarcha family, and in exchange, the FBI would look the other way, protecting the Winter Hill Gang from other law enforcement agencies. This corrupt bargain created a monster. While the FBI focused all its energy on taking down the Patriarchas, their own informant, Whitey Bulger, was allowed to operate with total impunity, building his own drug trafficking empire. The second, and even more devastating, crack was the FBI's new legal strategy, the RICO Act. For years, prosecutors could only convict mobsters for individual crimes. But with the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, the government could now prosecute the entire criminal enterprise. They could target the whole family, from the boss down to the soldiers, just for being part of a corrupt organization. The first major use of this new weapon in New England came in Boston. The FBI targeted Patriarcha's underboss, Jerry Angulo. In a daring operation in 1981, aided by a diagram provided by their informants Bulger and Flemmi, FBI agents broke into Angulo's headquarters on Prince Street and planted a bug. For months, the FBI listened as Angulo and his crew openly discussed their entire criminal world. They were caught on tape talking about loan sharking, gambling, and even ordering a murder. The tapes were pure gold. The all-powerful underboss had no idea his every word was being recorded. He was even caught boasting, "We're a fucking bookmaker. I wouldn't be in legitimate business for all the fucking money in the world." The bug in Angulo's office and the corrupt protection of the Winter Hill Gang were the first tremors of an earthquake that would soon tear the New England underworld apart. Section 5. The Fall. The beginning of the end came on July 11, 1984. Raymond Patriarcha Sr., the undisputed boss of New England for over 30 years, died of a heart attack. The man who seemed immortal was gone, and the power vacuum he left was instant and chaotic. Before his death, he had made a critical mistake. He named his son, Raymond Patriarcha Jr., as his successor. Patriarcha Jr. didn't have his father's cunning or his ruthlessness. He was seen as a weak leader, and the family, which had been held together by the sheer force of his father's will, started to splinter. The Boston faction, already crippled by the Angiulo convictions, and the Providence faction fought for control. The government, sensing blood in the water, pressed its advantage. The RICO Act was now being used with devastating effect. In 1986, Jerry Angiulo and his top guys were convicted based on the FBI's bugging operation. Angiulo, who had boasted he'd be back before my pork chops get cold, was sentenced to 45 years in prison. This was followed by a wave of indictments that systematically took down the family's leadership. The internal chaos exploded into open war. In the late 1980s, a renegade Boston faction led by Joseph J.R. Russo challenged Patriarca Jr.'s leadership. This conflict culminated in the 1989 murder of William "Billy the Wild Man" Grasso, Patriarca Jr.'s underboss, who was killed by his own men. The family was eating itself alive. The final nail in the coffin came in the early 1990s. In 1990, Patriarca Jr. and over 20 other members were hit with massive RICO charges. The evidence was overwhelming, and included a secret FBI recording of a Mafia induction ceremony held in a Medford, Massachusetts home in 1989, where new members swore a blood oath of loyalty. Faced with undeniable proof of their criminal enterprise, Patriarca Jr. pleaded guilty in 1992 and was sentenced to 8 years in prison. With Patriarca Jr. gone, a vicious power struggle for the scraps of the empire erupted. A new boss, Francis "Cadillac Frank" Salem, took over, but he was immediately challenged by a rival faction. The ensuing war led to a string of murders. Salem himself survived being shot multiple times outside a Saugus pancake house in 1989. And what about the Winter Hill Gang? Their end was just as dramatic. In late 1994, tipped off by his corrupt FBI handler John Connolly, Whitey Bulger fled Boston just before a massive racketeering indictment came down. His disappearance finally exposed the decades of corruption in the Boston FBI. Connolly was eventually convicted of racketeering and second-degree murder for protecting Bulger. Bulger himself remained a fugitive for 16 years before being captured in Santa Monica in 2011. He was murdered in prison in 2018. The conviction of Frank Salem in 2018 for the 1993 murder of a nightclub owner was the final echo of a bygone era. The old titans of the New England underworld were all dead or in prison for life. The dark takeover was officially over. Conclusion and legacy. What's left of the Patriarca crime family today is just a shadow of the organization that once held New England in its grip. The grand empire of fear and money built by Raymond Patriarca has crumbled. The family's membership has dwindled from over 100 made men at its peak to maybe just a handful of aging mobsters. The once unbreakable code of silence, omerta, was shattered by informants like Joseph Barboza, Whitey Bulger, and eventually even Frank Salem himself. The relentless RICO prosecutions of the 80s and 90s, combined with bloody and self-destructive infighting, was a death blow. The leadership was decapitated, and as one federal prosecutor noted, there was nobody with the strength left to step up. The final, symbolic end came in 2024, when the FBI's Boston office, which once had an entire squad dedicated to fighting the Mafia, quietly disbanded it. The war, for all practical purposes, was over. The legacy of the Patriarca family is a dark and complicated chapter in American history. It's a story of how unchecked ambition can forge an empire, and how corruption and betrayal can bring it all to ruin. The names of Raymond Patriarca, Jerry Angiulo, and Frank Salem are no longer whispered in fear on Federal Hill or in the North End. They are footnotes in history, cautionary tales of a brutal era. The iron fist that once held New England so tightly has rusted away, leaving behind only the memories of a dark and violent reign. CTA. If you found this look into America's criminal underworld fascinating, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next deep dive. Let us know in the comments which organized crime story you want us to tackle next. Thanks for watching.